In the summer of 1867, Margaret Sinclair stands at her bedroom window in the Dakota Territory, 3 days away from marrying Vincent Kane, a man whose cruelty is legendary across the frontier, to save her family from financial ruin. But when an earthquake shatters her wedding day and throws her into the arms of Vincent's compassionate twin brother James, Margaret discovers that sometimes fate intervenes in the most unexpected ways. Will she find the courage to choose love over duty, even if it means risking everything she's tried to protect? The rooster's crow cut through the morning silence like a knife, jolting Margaret Sinclair from dreams that tasted sweeter than honey. She pressed her face deeper into her pillow, trying to hold onto the fading images of a life where she could choose her own path. But reality crashed over her like cold water from the well. Today marked exactly 3 days until she would become Mrs. Vincent Kane. Rolling over in her narrow bed, Margaret stared at the wooden ceiling of their small house on the edge of Millbrook. The Dakota Territory stretched endlessly beyond these walls, wild and free under the summer sky of 1867. How she envied that freedom. The floorboards creaked as she sat up, her bare feet finding the cool wood. Through her thin nightgown, she could feel the morning chill that would soon give way to another scorching day. "Margaret!" Her father's voice boomed from downstairs, sharp with the worry that had lived in his tone for months now. "Come help your sister with breakfast." She pulled on her simple brown dress, the one she'd worn nearly every day since they'd been forced to sell her nicer clothes to pay the grocer. The mirror above her washstand reflected a young woman who looked older than her 22 years. Her auburn hair hung limp around her shoulders, and dark circles shadowed her green eyes. 3 sleepless nights would do that to a person. Downstairs, the kitchen buzzed with nervous energy. Clara stood at the stove, stirring porridge with movements too quick and jerky. Their father, Robert Sinclair, sat hunched over his coffee cup like it held the answers to all their troubles. His once proud shoulders had curved inward over the past year, bent under the weight of debts that seemed to grow larger each passing day. "The store's ledger shows we're behind on 3 more payments," he said without looking up. If this marriage doesn't happen, he didn't need to finish. They all knew what would come next. The bank would take the general store that had been in their family for 15 years. They'd lose their home, their livelihood, everything their mother had worked to build before the fever took her 5 years ago. Margaret poured herself coffee, the bitter liquid matching her mood. "Has anyone considered that maybe Vincent Kane isn't our only option?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Her father's head snapped up, his gray eyes flashing with desperation. "Margaret Rose Sinclair, don't you dare start with that nonsense again. Vincent Kane is offering to pay every debt we owe, plus enough to keep the store running for years. Do you have a better solution hiding in your hope chest?" Clara shot Margaret a warning look. They'd had this conversation too many times, always ending with their father's face turning red and his voice rising to a shout. But Margaret couldn't help herself. The thought of spending her life tied to a man who treated women like property made her stomach twist into knots. "I've heard stories about how he treats people," Margaret said quietly. "The way he talks to his workers, how he drove the Peterson family off their land just because he wanted their water rights." "Stories," her father scoffed. "Jealous gossip from people who wish they had half his success. Vincent Kane is the richest man in 3 counties. He can afford to be particular about business." "Particular?" Margaret's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "Father, he once horsewhipped a ranch hand for looking at him wrong. That's not particular, that's cruel." Robert slammed his coffee cup down so hard that liquid splashed across the worn wooden table. "Enough! We are 3 days away from saving this family, and I won't have you destroying our only chance with your romantic foolishness. You'll marry Vincent Kane, and you'll be grateful for the opportunity." The silence that followed felt heavy as a thundercloud. Clara kept stirring the porridge even though it was clearly ready. Margaret stared at the coffee stains spreading across the table, thinking they looked like tears. "What if?" Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "What if Margaret taught school instead? Miss Henderson is getting married next month, and they'll need a new teacher." Their father's laugh held no humor. "A schoolteacher's salary?" Clara, we owe more money than a teacher makes in 5 years. Besides, respectable women don't work once they're married. Vincent's made that quite clear. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd dreamed of teaching since she was 12 years old. Had even started preparing lessons in secret. The idea that marriage would end those dreams forever felt like losing a piece of her soul. A knock at the front door made them all freeze. Margaret's heart began to race. Surely it was too early for visitors, unless something had gone wrong with the wedding plans. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to answer. Margaret heard muffled voices, then Clara's surprised gasp. When she returned to the kitchen, her face was pale as fresh milk. "It's James Kane," Clara said, her eyes wide. "Vincent's brother. He says he needs to speak with you, Father. Something about the wedding arrangements." Margaret had heard about James Kane but had never met him. People said he was Vincent's twin brother, but completely different in every way that mattered. Where Vincent was known for his harsh business dealings, James had a reputation for fairness. Where Vincent inspired fear, James earned respect. Robert straightened his shirt and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Show him to the parlor, Clara." "Margaret, go upstairs and make yourself presentable." But Margaret found herself frozen in place, curiosity stronger than obedience. Through the kitchen doorway, she caught a glimpse of a tall man removing his hat in their small parlor. His dark hair caught the morning light streaming through their best window, and when he turned slightly, she saw a profile that was indeed identical to Vincent's, yet somehow completely different. Where Vincent's face always seemed carved from stone, this man's features held warmth. Where Vincent's eyes were cold as winter streams, this man seemed to hold depths of kindness that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. James Kane's voice carried into the kitchen, low and respectful as he spoke to her father. "Mr. Sinclair, I hope I'm not intruding, but there's been a development that affects the wedding plans." Margaret's heart nearly stopped. A development? What could that possibly mean? Was Vincent calling off the marriage? Relief and terror warred in her chest. Relief at the thought of escape, terror at what that would mean for her family's future. She crept closer to the doorway, straining to hear every word. Whatever James Kane had come to tell them, Margaret had the feeling it was going to change everything. Margaret pressed herself against the kitchen doorframe, her heart hammering so loud she was certain everyone in the parlor could hear it. James Kane stood with his back to her, his broad shoulders filling out a simple white shirt that spoke of honest work rather than drawing room discussions. Unlike his brother's fancy suits, James dressed like a man who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. "Please sit down," her father said, gesturing to their best chair, the one with only a small tear in the arm that Clara had cleverly hidden with a doily. "Can we offer you coffee? Margaret makes it stronger than most folks prefer, but it'll wake you up proper." James's chuckle was warm as summer rain. "Thank you, but I can't stay long. Vincent's expecting me back at the ranch within the hour." He remained standing, his hat held respectfully in his hands. "Sir, I came because I thought you should know about some changes Vincent's planning for after the wedding." Margaret's stomach dropped to her toes. "Changes? What kind of changes?" Robert leaned forward in his chair, his face eager and worried at the same time. "Nothing that would affect our agreement, I hope?" "Not the financial arrangements, no," James said carefully. "But Vincent's decided that once Margaret becomes his wife, he wants to move her away from Millbrook. He's purchased property near Deadwood, about 2 days' ride north of here." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. 2 days away? That would mean leaving Clara, leaving her father, leaving everything she'd ever known. She'd always assumed she'd at least be able to visit her family regularly, to help with the store when needed. 2 days. Robert's voice cracked slightly. That's quite a distance. Vincent believes a wife should focus entirely on her husband's needs without the distraction of family obligations. James continued, and Margaret could hear the distaste in his voice despite his polite tone. "He plans to tell Margaret after the ceremony, but I thought it was only fair that you knew beforehand." Margaret bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. Vincent hadn't just bought a wife, he'd bought a prisoner. The thought of being trapped so far from everyone she loved, with a man who saw her as property to be moved wherever he pleased, made her legs feel weak as water. "I see," Robert said slowly. "Well, I suppose that's Vincent's right as her husband." "Is it?" James's question hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Margaret found herself holding her breath. In all her 22 years, she'd never heard anyone question a husband's absolute authority over his wife. The very idea seemed dangerous, revolutionary even. "I mean no disrespect, Mr. Sinclair," James continued. "But Margaret's a grown woman with her own thoughts and feelings. Shouldn't she have some say in where she lives?" Robert's chair creaked as he shifted uncomfortably. "Now see here, young man, that's not how marriage works. A wife follows her husband, simple as that." "Simple for who?" James asked quietly. The question sent shivers down Margaret's spine. She'd never thought about it that way. Simple for who, indeed? Certainly not simple for the women who had to leave everything behind, who had to reshape their entire lives around someone else's wishes. Clara appeared beside Margaret in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. She'd obviously been listening too, and the sisters exchanged a look of pure panic. 2 days away might as well be 200 for all the difference it would make in their ability to see each other. "There's something else," James said, and Margaret's heart sank further. How could there possibly be more bad news? Vincent's also decided that Margaret shouldn't maintain any correspondence with her family for the first year of marriage. He believes it will help her adjust to her new life without being pulled backward by old attachments. This time, Robert stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. "Now that's going too far. She's my daughter, not some stranger he's adopting." "I agree completely," James said, and there was steel beneath his gentle tone. "Which is why I thought you should know. These weren't part of your original agreement with my brother." Margaret's mind raced. Vincent hadn't just planned to isolate her physically. He wanted to cut her off emotionally too. No letters, no visits, no contact with the people who loved her most. It would be like dying while still breathing. "What exactly are you suggesting I do about it?" Robert asked, sinking back into his chair like a man defeated. James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his words were careful, measured. "I'm suggesting that maybe Margaret should know what she's agreeing to before she says, 'I do.' A marriage built on secrets isn't really a marriage at all." Through the doorway, Margaret watched James turn slightly, and for just a moment, his eyes met hers. The contact lasted only seconds, but in that brief connection, she saw something that made her breath catch. Understanding, sympathy, and something else she didn't dare name. James looked away quickly, but not before Margaret caught the flash of anger in his storm-gray eyes. Not anger at her, but anger for her, at a situation that trapped them both in different ways. "I should go," James said, settling his hat back on his head. "Vincent will be wondering where I've gotten to. But Mr. Sinclair, maybe it would be worth having an honest conversation with Margaret about what this marriage really means. She deserves to make this choice with all the facts." Robert nodded stiffly. "I appreciate you coming, Mr. Kane, even if the news wasn't what we hoped to hear." As James moved toward the front door, he paused and looked back. "One more thing, sir. Vincent may be my brother, but that doesn't mean I agree with everything he does. Margaret seems like a fine young woman who deserves better than to be treated like cargo to be shipped wherever convenient." The front door closed with a soft click, leaving the house in stunned silence. Margaret remained frozen in the doorway, her mind spinning with everything she'd just learned. Clara's hand found hers, squeezing tight enough to hurt. "Father," Clara said quietly, "you can't seriously expect Margaret to agree to this. No letters? No visits? She'll be completely alone." Robert rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly looking every one of his 53 years. "What choice do we have, Clara? If we break this engagement now, we lose everything. The store, the house, our reputation in town. We'll be ruined." "But Margaret will be ruined too," Clara pressed. "Just in a different way." Margaret finally found her voice. "Father, James Kane was right. I should have known about these conditions before agreeing to marry Vincent. This changes everything." "It changes nothing," Robert's voice cracked like a whip. "We are 3 days away from salvation, Margaret. 3 days. I won't let your feelings destroy our family's future." "What about my future?" Margaret asked, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "What about the fact that I'll never see you or Clara again? What about the fact that Vincent's planning to cut me off from everything I love?" "You'll learn to love your new life," Robert said, but his words sounded hollow even to him. "How can I love a life where I'm treated like a prisoner?" Margaret's composure finally cracked. "Father, please, there has to be another way." But even as she said the words, Margaret knew there wasn't another way. At least, not one that would save her family from financial ruin. She was trapped as surely as if Vincent had already locked her in a cage. The worst part was that James Cain's visit had shown her something she hadn't expected, that not all men thought the way Vincent did. Some men, like James, believed women deserved choices, deserved respect, deserved to be treated as human beings rather than property. Which only made her fate seem that much crueler, knowing what she could have had if circumstances were different. The wedding dress hung in Margaret's bedroom like a ghost waiting to claim her soul. She stared at the white silk gown that had arrived that morning, delivered by one of Vincent's ranch hands with orders that she was to wear it exactly as provided. No changes, no personal touches, nothing that might suggest she had any say in her own wedding day. Margaret ran her fingers along the expensive fabric, feeling sick to her stomach. The dress was beautiful, she had to admit, with tiny pearls sewn along the neckline and sleeves that would fall gracefully to her wrists. But it felt like a costume for a play she didn't want to perform in, a role she'd been forced to accept without ever reading the script. "It's lovely," Clara said from the doorway, though her voice held no enthusiasm. Vincent certainly spared no expense. "Money can't buy happiness," Margaret replied, then immediately felt foolish for saying something so obvious. Of course money couldn't buy happiness, but it could buy security, and right now, her family needed security more than they needed her happiness. Clara entered the room and sat on the edge of Margaret's narrow bed. "I've been thinking about what James Cain said yesterday, about Vincent's plans to move you away, to cut you off from us." Margaret's chest tightened at the mention of James's name. She'd been trying not to think about him, about the way his eyes had seemed to understand her trapped feeling without her having to say a word. It was dangerous to think about James Cain, dangerous to wonder what her life might be like if she were marrying him instead of his cruel brother. "What about it?" Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear Clara's thoughts. "I think we should tell people in town, let them know what Vincent's really planning. Maybe if enough people hear about it, social pressure will force him to change his mind." Margaret shook her head sadly. "Clara, Vincent Cain doesn't care what people think. He's rich enough to do whatever he pleases, and powerful enough that no one will challenge him. But surely some people would speak up for you. Mrs. Henderson from the schoolhouse, or Reverend Williams, or—" "And say what?" Margaret interrupted. "That a husband shouldn't have the right to decide where his wife lives. That women should be able to refuse their husband's wishes. Clara, that kind of talk would just make things worse for everyone." The truth hung between them like a heavy curtain. In 1867, in the Dakota Territory, women had very few rights once they married. A husband could move his wife wherever he chose, could forbid her from seeing her family, could make decisions about every aspect of her life without consulting her at all. The law was on Vincent's side, even if decency wasn't. A commotion outside drew both sisters to the window. Down in the dusty main street of Millbrook, they could see a crowd gathering around the general store. Margaret's heart lurched. Had something happened to their father? "Look," Clara pointed toward the crowd. "Isn't that James Cain?" Margaret pressed her face closer to the glass. Sure enough, James stood in the center of the group, his dark hair unmistakable even from this distance. He was talking animatedly with several townspeople, his hands moving as he spoke. Even Dr. Morrison was there, nodding seriously at whatever James was saying. "What do you think he's telling them?" Clara asked. Before Margaret could answer, their father burst through the front door downstairs, his boots pounding on the wooden floors as he climbed the stairs 2 at a time. When he appeared in Margaret's doorway, His face was flushed red with anger. "That Kane boy is stirring up trouble," Robert announced without greeting. "He's down there filling people's heads with nonsense about Vincent's character, making it sound like you're being forced into this marriage against your will." Margaret's heart began to race. What exactly is he saying? "He's telling people about Vincent's plans to move you away, about the no-contact rule with family. He's making Vincent sound like some kind of monster who's buying a slave instead of taking a wife." Clara and Margaret exchanged glances. "Well," Clara said carefully, "isn't that basically what's happening?" Their father's face grew even redder. "Clara Rose Sinclair, you watch your tongue. Vincent Kane is saving this family from ruin, and I won't have either of my daughters speaking ill of him." But Margaret barely heard her father's words. Her mind was spinning with the realization that James Kane was down there in the street, publicly defending her, risking his own relationship with his brother for her sake. The thought made her feel warm and terrified at the same time. "Father," she said slowly, "what if James is right? What if there's something wrong with a marriage where the husband treats his wife like property?" Robert's eyes flashed dangerously. "Margaret, I'm warning you." "No, listen to me," Margaret continued, surprising herself with her boldness. "James Kane seems to think women deserve better treatment than Vincent's planning to give me. Maybe we should pay attention to what he's saying. James Kane is a romantic fool who's never had to worry about putting food on the table or keeping a roof over his family's heads," Robert snapped. "He can afford to have fancy ideas about women's rights because he's never had real responsibilities." Margaret felt a spark of anger flare in her chest. "So women don't deserve respect just because respecting them might be inconvenient?" The slap came so fast Margaret didn't see it coming. Her father's hand connected with her cheek with a sharp crack that echoed through the small room. Clara gasped, and Margaret pressed her hand to her stinging face, staring at her father in shock. Robert immediately looked ashamed of himself, his anger crumbling into desperation. "Margaret, I'm sorry, I didn't mean, but you have to understand we're out of options. If this marriage doesn't happen, we lose everything. Everything your mother worked for, everything I've tried to build. I can't let that happen." Margaret's cheek throbbed, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. She'd never seen her father look so broken, so afraid. For the first time, she truly understood the weight he'd been carrying since their debts began piling up. "I know you're scared, Father," she said quietly, "but I'm scared too. I'm scared of spending my whole life trapped with a man who sees me as property. I'm scared of never seeing you and Clara again. I'm scared of becoming someone I don't recognize." Robert sank into the chair by Margaret's small desk, suddenly looking much older than his 53 years. "What choice do we have, Margaret? What other choice is there?" Before Margaret could answer, Clara suddenly straightened at the window. "The crowd's breaking up," she reported. "James is walking this way. I think he's coming here." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. James Kane was coming to their house again? After stirring up the entire town with talk about Vincent's marriage plans? "That boy's got more courage than sense," Robert muttered, but there was something almost like admiration in his voice. Within minutes, they heard the familiar knock at the front door. This time, Margaret didn't hesitate. She hurried downstairs ahead of her father, eager to hear what James had to say. When she opened the door, she found him standing on their small porch, his hat in his hands and his storm-gray eyes intense with purpose. "Miss Sinclair," he said formally, though his gaze searched her face with obvious concern. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I have something important to discuss with you and your father." "Of course," Margaret said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Please, come in." As James stepped into their small parlor, Margaret caught the scent of leather and sage that seemed to follow him everywhere. Up close, she could see that his hands were calloused from honest work, that his simple clothes were clean but well-worn, that everything about him spoke of a man who earned his way in the world rather than simply inheriting it. "Mr. Sinclair," James said as Robert appeared in the parlor doorway, "I owe you an apology for speaking publicly about your family's private business. That wasn't my place, and I'm sorry if I've caused you embarrassment." Robert studied James with suspicious eyes. What exactly were you hoping to accomplish with all that talk? James met his gaze steadily. I was hoping to give Margaret a choice. The simple words hung in the air like a challenge, and Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. A choice? What kind of choice could James possibly offer that would change anything? Margaret's hands trembled as she poured coffee for James Kane, the simple task suddenly feeling as difficult as threading a needle in the dark. The kitchen seemed smaller with him sitting at their worn wooden table, his presence filling the space with an energy that made her skin tingle with nervous awareness. Thank you, James said softly as she set the cup before him. Their fingers brushed for just a moment, and Margaret felt a jolt of electricity run up her arm. She pulled back quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed her reaction. Clara bustled around the kitchen, preparing lunch with movements that were too quick, too nervous. Their father sat across from James, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression guarded and suspicious. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Now then, Robert said, his voice gruff. What's this about giving Margaret a choice? Far as I know, she's already made her choice. The wedding's tomorrow. James took a slow sip of his coffee, clearly choosing his words carefully. Mr. Sinclair, I spent the morning talking to folks in town. Dr. Morrison, Reverend Williams, the bank president. Interesting conversations. Margaret felt her heart start to race. What kind of conversations? The kind that revealed some facts about your family's situation that Vincent neglected to mention to me. James's gray eyes moved from Robert to Margaret, and she saw something in them that looked almost like hope. Did you know that your father's debts aren't nearly as large as Vincent claimed they were? Robert's face went pale. What are you talking about? James reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I took the liberty of visiting the bank this morning. Mr. Peterson was quite helpful in explaining the actual amount owed versus the amount Vincent told you he'd be paying. With shaking hands, Robert took the paper and unfolded it. As he read, his face went from pale to red to purple. This can't be right. What does it say, Father? Clara asked, moving closer to read over his shoulder. It says. Robert's voice cracked. It says we owe $800, not $3,000 like Vincent claimed. Margaret felt the room spin around her. 800? But Vincent said he was paying $3,000 to cover all our debts plus extra to keep the store running. Vincent lied, James said simply. He told you the debt was much larger than it actually was, then offered to pay the inflated amount to make himself look generous. Classic business tactic, create a bigger problem than actually exists, then swoop in as the hero with a solution. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret sank into the remaining chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. You're saying Vincent tricked us? I'm saying Vincent manipulated the situation to get what he wanted, at a price that seemed reasonable to your father but was actually far more than necessary. Robert stared at the paper in his hands as if it might burst into flames. But $800 is still more money than we have. We can't pay it back any more than we could pay back $3,000. James leaned forward, his expression earnest. Actually, you can. Dr. Morrison mentioned that your store's been doing better lately, bringing in nearly $50 a month profit. At that rate, you could pay off the real debt in less than 2 years without anyone having to sacrifice their future. Margaret's mind reeled. 2 years was a long time, but it wasn't forever. It wasn't a lifetime sentence of isolation and misery with a cruel husband. But what about the monthly payments we can't make now? That's where things get interesting, James continued. I spoke with Mr. Peterson at the bank. He's willing to restructure the loan with smaller monthly payments if you can put down $100 right away. $100? Robert laughed bitterly. Son, if we had $100, we wouldn't be in this mess. James was quiet for a moment, studying his coffee cup. When he looked up, his eyes met Margaret's directly. What if someone was willing to provide that $100 as a gift? No strings attached. Margaret's heart stopped beating entirely. You mean you would? I've saved some money over the years. Money that's just sitting in the bank doing nothing useful. I can't think of a better use for it than helping a good family stay together. Robert pushed back from the table so hard his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Absolutely not. I won't accept charity, especially not from a Kane. It's not charity, James said calmly. It's an investment in what's right. And I'm not offering because I'm a Kane. I'm offering despite being a Kane. Margaret stared at James, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. He was offering to save her family, to free her from the marriage to Vincent, and asking for nothing in return? It seemed too good to be true, too perfect to be real. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this for us? James's eyes softened as he looked at her. Because everyone deserves the chance to choose their own path. Because marriage should be about love, not debt payments. Because... He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. Because I've seen what my brother is capable of, and no woman deserves to be trapped with a man who sees her as property. Clara had gone very still by the stove, her wooden spoon frozen in midair. Are you saying Vincent would hurt Margaret? James's jaw tightened. I'm saying Vincent has never learned the difference between owning something and caring for it. He treats his horses, his cattle, and his workers all the same way, as tools to be used for his benefit. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the old clock on the wall. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as she tried to absorb everything James had told them. Vincent had lied about their debts. The bank was willing to work with them, and James Kane was offering to solve their problems with no conditions attached. There has to be a catch, Robert said suspiciously. Nobody gives away $100 for nothing. You're right, James said, and Margaret's heart sank. There is something I want in return. Here it comes, Margaret thought. The trap, the strings attached, the price that would make this miracle impossible. I want Vincent to know that Margaret chose not to marry him, James continued. I want him to understand that she had options and picked freedom over his money. Margaret blinked in surprise. That's all. That's everything, James said seriously. Vincent needs to learn that he can't buy people like livestock at market. Maybe if enough people stand up to him, he'll start treating others with basic human decency. Robert was shaking his head before James finished speaking. You're asking me to humiliate one of the most powerful men in the territory. Vincent Kane could destroy what's left of our business with a word to the right people. Could he? James asked. Or is that just another lie he's told to keep people afraid of him? Margaret found her voice again. James, what you're offering. It sounds too good to be true. What happens tomorrow when Vincent expects me to show up for the wedding? James's expression grew serious. Vincent will be angry. Very angry. He doesn't like being told no, especially by people he considers beneath him. But Margaret, his anger will pass. A lifetime of regret won't. The truth of his words hit Margaret like a physical blow. A lifetime of regret. That's exactly what awaited her if she went through with this marriage. Years and years of wondering what her life could have been if she'd had the courage to choose differently. I need time to think, she said quietly. Of course, James agreed. But Margaret, whatever you decide, decide for yourself. Not for your father's pride. Not for your family's reputation. Not for what people might say. Decide based on what you want your life to look like 10 years from now. He stood up from the table, his coffee barely touched. I'll be at the church tomorrow at 2 o'clock. That's when the wedding is supposed to start. If you want to accept my offer, meet me there. If not, I'll understand, and I'll never mention this conversation again. Margaret watched him walk toward the door, her mind spinning with possibilities she'd never dared imagine. Freedom, choice, a future she could shape with her own hands. But could she really be brave enough to take it? The earth beneath Margaret's feet began to shake at exactly 1:30 in the afternoon, just as she was pinning the last curl into place for her wedding. The tremor started small, like a freight train passing in the distance, but within seconds the whole house was groaning and swaying like a ship in a storm. Earthquake! Clara screamed, grabbing onto the doorframe as Margaret's mirror crashed to the floor, sending shards of glass skittering across the wooden boards. The wedding dress, hanging carefully on its hook, swayed back and forth like a dancing ghost. Margaret threw herself under her small desk as the world went mad around her. Books tumbled from shelves, the water pitcher on her washstand shattered against the wall, and somewhere downstairs she could hear their father shouting instructions that no one could follow over the terrible noise of the house fighting to stay standing. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. Margaret crawled out from under the desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through her broken window, she could see dust clouds rising from the main street of Millbrook, and people stumbling out of buildings like drunken dancers. But it was the black smoke curling up from the direction of the church that made her blood run cold. "Clara!" she called, rushing to find her sister. "Clara, are you hurt?" "I'm here." Clara's voice came from the hallway, shaky but strong. "The stairs are blocked, Margaret." A beam fell across them. Margaret looked down the stairway to see a thick wooden support beam wedged diagonally across the steps, too heavy for them to move alone. Below, she could hear their father calling their names, his voice tight with panic. "We're trapped up here, Father," Margaret shouted back. "The beam's too big." "I'm going for help," Robert called up. "Don't try to move it yourselves." As their father's footsteps faded toward the front door, Margaret and Clara looked at each other with wide eyes. The wedding was supposed to start in 30 minutes, but half the town was probably dealing with earthquake damage. More importantly, the church where she was supposed to meet James might be damaged or destroyed. "What do we do now?" Clara asked, gesturing toward the wedding dress that had somehow survived the shaking without a tear. Margaret stared at the white silk gown, her mind racing. The earthquake had changed everything, but had it changed her decision? Did she still want to meet James at the church and accept his offer of freedom? Or should she see this as a sign that she was meant to marry Vincent after all? Before she could answer, they heard horses approaching at a gallop. Through the cracked window, Margaret saw Vincent Kane riding up to their house, his face dark with fury even though dust and worry. Behind him rode 3 of his ranch hands, all looking grim as storm clouds. "Sinclair!" Vincent's voice boomed across the yard. "Where's my bride? The preacher's waiting, and I don't have time for delays." Margaret pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her heart racing. The preacher was waiting? How could the wedding still be happening when half the town was probably in ruins? "The church is damaged, Mr. Kane," she heard her father saying from the front porch. "Part of the roof caved in during the quake." "Then we'll hold it somewhere else," Vincent snapped. "The hotel parlor, your store, I don't care where. But I'm getting married today, earthquake or no earthquake." Margaret felt sick to her stomach. Vincent didn't care about the earthquake damage, didn't care if people were hurt or if buildings were destroyed. All he cared about was claiming his property on schedule. "Sir," Robert's voice was careful, respectful. "Perhaps we should postpone until—" "Are you trying to back out of our agreement, Sinclair?" Vincent's voice turned dangerous. "Because I can make your life very difficult if you think you can play games with me." Even from upstairs, Margaret could hear the threat in Vincent's tone. Clara grabbed her hand, squeezing tight enough to hurt. "Of course not, Mr. Kane," Robert said quickly. "It's just that Margaret and Clara are trapped upstairs." A beam fell across the staircase, and "Then get them down," Vincent interrupted. "I don't care if you have to tear the house apart board by board. I'm not leaving here without my bride." The cold determination in his voice made Margaret's skin crawl. This was the man she was supposed to promise to love, honor, and obey. A man who saw her as cargo to be collected regardless of circumstances. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house as Vincent's men came inside to assess the blocked staircase. Margaret could hear them discussing ways to move the beam, their voices practical and efficient. Within minutes, they'd have her down and dressed and standing at an altar somewhere, promising her life away to a man who cared more about keeping his schedule than her safety. "Margaret," Clara whispered. "What are you going to do?" Margaret looked at her sister's worried face, then at the wedding dress hanging innocently on its hook. Through the broken window, she could see more people emerging from damaged buildings, neighbors helping neighbors, the whole community pulling together in the face of disaster. That's when she saw him. James Kane was riding hard down the main street, his horse lathered with sweat and dust. But instead of heading toward their house, he was stopping at every damaged building, checking on people, helping where he could. Even from this distance, Margaret could see the genuine concern on his face as he spoke with Mrs. Henderson, whose house had lost half its front porch. The contrast between the two brothers couldn't have been clearer. Vincent had ridden straight to collect his property, while James was making sure his neighbors were safe. "I know what I have to do," Margaret said quietly. The sound of the beam being dragged across the floor reached them from downstairs. Vincent's men were making quick work of clearing the staircase, their efficiency born of fear of their employer's temper. "Miss Sinclair," one of the ranch hands called up. "Stairway's clear now. Mr. Kane wants you down here right away." Margaret looked at the wedding dress one more time, then at Clara's worried face. "Tell them I need 5 minutes to fix my hair and dress," she called down. "The earthquake messed everything up." 5 minutes. Vincent's voice carried up the stairs, cold as winter ice. "Not a second longer." As soon as the footsteps retreated, Margaret grabbed Clara's hands. "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to trust me completely." Clara's eyes widened. "What are you planning?" "I'm planning to choose my own life," Margaret said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "But I need your help to do it." Outside, the sound of James's horse drew closer, and Margaret felt her heart lift with hope. The earthquake had shaken everything loose: buildings, plans, expectations. Maybe it was time to let it shake loose her fears as well. But first, she had to get past Vincent and his men without them realizing what she intended to do. Margaret's bare feet made no sound as she crept down the newly cleared staircase, her heart pounding so loud she was certain everyone in the house could hear it. She'd left the wedding dress hanging upstairs and instead wore her simplest brown dress, the one she'd been wearing the day James first visited their home. From the parlor, she could hear Vincent's impatient voice giving orders to his men. "Check the back door. Make sure there's no other way out. I don't want any delays or dramatic escapes." The words sent a chill down Margaret's spine. Vincent was already treating her like a prisoner who might try to run. What would her life be like once she was legally his property? "Margaret, hurry up!" her father called from the bottom of the stairs. "Mr. Kane is waiting." "Coming, father," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. When she appeared in the parlor doorway, Vincent's pale eyes swept over her simple dress with obvious displeasure. "Where's your wedding gown? We're already behind schedule because of this earthquake nonsense." "I thought I should check on the neighbors first," Margaret said carefully. "Make sure no one was hurt in the quake." It seemed like the Christian thing to do. Vincent's expression turned thunderous. "The Christian thing to do is honor your commitments. Other people's problems aren't your concern anymore. I am." The casual cruelty in his words hit Margaret like a slap. Once she married him, she wouldn't even be allowed to show compassion to her neighbors? The cage she'd been trying to avoid was even smaller than she'd imagined. "Of course," she said quietly. "I just thought." "Don't think," Vincent interrupted. "Thinking is my job. Your job is to do what you're told when you're told to do it." One of Vincent's ranch hands shifted uncomfortably at his boss's harsh tone, but none of them spoke up. Margaret could see the fear in their eyes, fear of the man who controlled their livelihoods. "Now go put on your proper dress," Vincent continued. "We'll hold the ceremony at the hotel. I've already sent word to the preacher." Margaret nodded obediently, but as she turned toward the stairs, she caught sight of movement through the front window. James Kane was tying his horse to their fence post, his face grim with determination. Her breath caught in her throat. He'd come, just as he'd promised. But how could she get to him with Vincent watching her every move? "Actually," she said, turning back to Vincent, "I should check on our neighbors first. Mrs. Peterson next door is elderly, and her house looked damaged. It will only take a few minutes." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "I said no delays. But surely you wouldn't want people to think the Kane family doesn't care about their community," Margaret pressed, hoping to appeal to his pride. "What would folks say if they heard you wouldn't even let your bride check on injured neighbors?" For a moment, Vincent looked like he might explode. Then his expression shifted to calculating coldness. "Fine. 5 minutes. But you're not going alone. He gestured to one of his men. Jake, escort my bride to check on the neighbors. Don't let her out of your sight. Margaret's heart sank. She'd hoped to slip away and find James, but now she'd have a guard watching her every move. That's not necessary, she started to say, but Vincent cut her off. I decide what's necessary, he said flatly. Jake, go. The ranch hand named Jake looked about as uncomfortable with this assignment as Margaret felt. He was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes that reminded her of James. As they walked toward the front door, Margaret caught his eye and saw something that gave her hope. Sympathy. I'm sorry about this, miss, Jake said quietly as they stepped onto the front porch. Mr. Kane's just particular about things going according to plan. I understand, Margaret said, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. They walked across the dusty yard toward Mrs. Peterson's house, where the elderly woman was indeed sitting on her damaged front steps, looking dazed and confused. But Margaret's attention was drawn to the figure kneeling beside Mrs. Peterson, gently checking her for injuries. James Kane looked up as they approached, his storm-gray eyes meeting Margaret's with an intensity that made her knees weak. For just a moment, his gaze flicked to Jake, then back to her face, and she saw understanding pass between them. Miss Sinclair, James said formally, standing up and dusting off his knees. I was just making sure Mrs. Peterson wasn't hurt in the quake. How thoughtful, Margaret managed, her voice barely steady. Is she all right? Just shaken up, I think. But her kitchen chimney collapsed, so she'll need somewhere to stay until it can be repaired. Mrs. Peterson looked up at them with grateful eyes. James here says I can stay with the Williams family until my nephew can come fix the damage. Such a kind boy. Always was, even as a child. The contrast between James's automatic compassion and Vincent's selfish impatience couldn't have been clearer. Margaret felt her resolve strengthen. She would not, spend her life with a man who saw kindness as weakness. Jake, James said, addressing Vincent's ranch hand directly. I'm glad you're here. I was just about to ride over and tell Vincent about some trouble brewing at the north pasture. Looks like the earthquake spooked some of the cattle, and they've broken through the fence line. Jake's face went pale. Vincent Kane did not tolerate problems with his cattle, and the north pasture was one of his most valuable grazing areas. How bad is it? Jake asked, clearly torn between his duty to watch Margaret and his fear of Vincent's reaction to damaged property. Bad enough that Vincent's going to want every available man out there rounding up strays before they scatter to the four winds, James said seriously. Time's crucial with something like this. Margaret held her breath, understanding what James was trying to do. He was giving Jake a reason to leave her unguarded, creating an opportunity for them to talk privately. Jake looked back toward the Sinclair house, where Vincent was probably pacing impatiently, then at James's serious expression. The math was simple. Vincent would be far angrier about lost cattle than about Margaret being left alone for a few minutes. Miss, Jake said to Margaret, I need to go tell Mr. Kane about this cattle situation. Will you be all right here with Mrs. Peterson for just a minute? Of course, Margaret said, trying to keep the relief out of her voice. I'll make sure she's comfortable. As soon as Jake hurried back toward the house, James moved closer to Margaret. Are you all right? He asked quietly. When I saw the damage from the earthquake, I was afraid. I'm fine, Margaret said, though her hands were shaking. James, about your offer yesterday. You don't have to decide anything right now, he interrupted gently. The earthquakes changed everything. The church is damaged. Half the town's dealing with repairs. The church being damaged doesn't matter, Margaret said, surprising herself with her firmness. Vincent's planning to hold the ceremony at the hotel instead. He doesn't care about the earthquake or who might be hurt. He just wants to get married on schedule. James's jaw tightened. That sounds like Vincent. Mrs. Peterson had dozed off in the warm afternoon sun, leaving Margaret and James with a precious few moments of privacy. Through the window of her own house, Margaret could see Jake talking rapidly to Vincent, gesturing toward the north pasture. James, she said quietly, I want to accept your offer. I want to choose freedom instead of Vincent's money. His eyes lit up with hope and relief. Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. Vincent will never forgive either of us. I'm sure, Margaret said, and for the first time in months, she felt completely certain about something. I'd rather face Vincent's anger than spend my life regretting what I was too afraid to choose. James smiled, and the warmth in his expression made Margaret's heart flutter like a bird taking flight. Then we need to move quickly. Vincent's going to realize soon that the cattle story was just a distraction. What do we do? Can you get away from the house without being seen? Maybe slip out the back while Vincent's distracted with the cattle situation. Margaret nodded. Clara will help me. But James, what about my family? If I don't marry Vincent, how will they pay their debts? James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. I told you yesterday, I have the money to help your father. This contains $200, enough to pay off the real debt and give your family a fresh start. Margaret stared at the pouch, overwhelmed by his generosity. I can't ask you to give up your life savings for us. You're not asking, James said gently. I'm offering. Margaret, money's just paper and metal. What we're talking about is your life, your freedom, your chance to be happy. That's worth more than any amount of money. Through the window, Margaret could see Vincent's face growing redder as Jake continued his story about the cattle. Any minute now, Vincent would either send Jake to deal with the problem or decide to investigate it himself. I have to go, she said reluctantly. But James, how do I know I can trust you? How do I know this isn't just another trap? James looked directly into her eyes, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. Because I'm not asking you to marry me, Margaret. I'm asking you to be free. What you do with that freedom, whether you choose to be a teacher or travel or even marry someone else someday, that's entirely up to you. The simple honesty in his words took Margaret's breath away. He wasn't trying to replace Vincent as her owner. He was offering to help her own herself. Meet me at the old mill at sunset, she said quickly. If I can get away, I'll be there. And if you can't? Margaret glanced back at her house, where Vincent was now standing on the porch, scanning the yard with suspicious eyes. Then I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. As Vincent's gaze found them across the yard, Margaret quickly turned her attention back to Mrs. Peterson, pretending to be concerned about the elderly woman's comfort. But her heart was racing with hope and terror in equal measure. In just a few hours, she would either be free or trapped forever. The screaming started at exactly 4 o'clock, just as Margaret was pinning her hair into a simple bun instead of the elaborate wedding style Vincent had demanded. Clara's voice cut through the afternoon air like a knife, followed by the thundering of hooves and men shouting orders in the yard below. Margaret rushed to her window to see Vincent's ranch hands surrounding a lone rider who'd galloped up to their house at breakneck speed. The man was covered in dust and blood, his shirt torn, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. Even from upstairs, Margaret could see the panic in his movements as he slid from his saddle. "Boss!" the rider gasped, stumbling toward Vincent. "We got big trouble at the North Pasture." Margaret's blood turned to ice. The North Pasture was where James had told Jake the cattle were having problems. But James had made that story up to create a distraction. So what was this rider talking about? Vincent stormed across the yard, his face dark with fury. "What kind of trouble, Martinez?" "Rustlers, sir. At least a dozen of them, maybe more. They hit us during the earthquake when everyone was scattered. Took near 50 head of your best breeding stock." The words hit the gathered men like physical blows. 50 head of cattle represented thousands of dollars, more money than most families in the territory saw in a lifetime. But worse than the financial loss was the insult. Someone had dared to steal from Vincent Kane. When? Vincent's voice was deadly quiet, which Margaret had learned was far more dangerous than when he shouted. "Must have been during the quake, sir. Ground was shaking so bad we couldn't tell the difference between thunder and hoofbeats. By the time we realized what was happening, they were already driving the herd toward the Badlands." Vincent's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Which direction?" "Southeast, toward Devil's Canyon." "But boss, there's something else." Martinez glanced nervously at the other men. We think we know who's behind it. Margaret pressed closer to the window, her heart hammering. Whatever Martinez was about to say, she could tell from his expression it was going to make everything worse. Spit it out, Vincent snarled. It's that settler family, the Andersons. The ones you've been trying to buy out for months. Jake saw Tom Anderson's horse among the rustlers, and they left tracks heading straight toward his property. Vincent's face went from red to purple, the veins in his neck standing out like ropes. The Andersons? Those dirt farmers think they can steal from me? Margaret felt sick to her stomach. She knew the Anderson family. They had 3 young children and barely enough land to grow food for themselves. The idea that they would risk everything to steal cattle seemed impossible, but Vincent was already accepting it as fact. Get every man we have, Vincent ordered, his voice carrying the promise of violence. Every last one. We're riding out now. But sir, Jake spoke up hesitantly, what about the wedding? Miss Sinclair's waiting, and the preacher's already at the hotel. Vincent whirled on him with such fury that Jake actually stepped backward. The wedding will wait. Nobody steals from Vincent Kane and lives to tell about it. Margaret's mind raced. If Vincent rode out after the rustlers, she'd have the perfect opportunity to slip away and meet James at the old mill. But the Anderson family, if they were innocent, Vincent's rage would destroy them. And if they were guilty, they were probably already dead men. Load up with ammunition, Vincent continued, his voice growing colder by the second. We're not just getting my cattle back. We're sending a message that will echo across this territory for years to come. The men scattered to follow his orders, their movements quick and efficient. Margaret had seen Vincent angry before, but this was different. This was the controlled fury of a man who'd been personally insulted and intended to make someone pay dearly for it. Clara appeared in Margaret's doorway, her face pale with fear. Did you hear what they're saying? They're talking about the Anderson family like they're already guilty. I heard, Margaret said grimly. Clara, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to promise not to ask questions. What kind of something? Margaret pulled her sister into the room and closed the door. I need you to saddle Buttercup and tie her behind the house where no one can see her from the front yard. Clara's eyes widened. Margaret, you're not thinking of... I'm thinking of a lot of things, Margaret interrupted. But first, I need to know that Horse is ready if I need her. Father will kill you if you run away. And Vincent. Clara shuddered. Vincent will kill you and Father both. Maybe, Margaret agreed. But Clara, what if the Anderson family didn't steal those cattle? What if Vincent's about to destroy innocent people because he's too angry to think straight? What could you possibly do about it? Margaret looked out the window again, watching Vincent's men load rifles and check their ammunition. I don't know yet, but I can't just sit here doing nothing while people might get hurt. Clara grabbed her sister's hands. Margaret, please. I know you want to help, but this is dangerous. These are grown men with guns. Not some problem you can solve with kind words and good intentions. Before Margaret could answer, they heard horses thundering out of the yard. Through the window, they watched Vincent leading a dozen armed men toward the southeast, their faces grim with purpose. Dust clouds rose behind them like the smoke from a funeral pyre. They're gone, Clara said unnecessarily. Margaret was already moving toward her wardrobe, pulling out her riding clothes. Help me change, Clara. And don't try to talk me out of this. Talk you out of what exactly? You still haven't told me what you're planning. Margaret paused in her preparations, meeting her sister's worried gaze. I'm planning to ride to the Anderson place and warn them that Vincent's coming. If they're innocent, they deserve a chance to explain themselves before Vincent decides they're guilty. And if they're not innocent, then at least their children won't have to watch their father get shot down like a dog. Clara sank onto Margaret's bed, her face in her hands. This is insane. You're going to get yourself killed over people you barely know. Maybe, Margaret said, pulling on her riding skirt. But Clara, if I marry Vincent tomorrow, I'll spend the rest of my life watching him destroy people who can't fight back. I'll become part of his cruelty just by staying silent. I can't do that. So instead you're going to ride into the middle of an armed confrontation? Margaret finished changing and turned to face her sister. I'm going to try to prevent an armed confrontation. There's a difference. Clara stood up, her expression suddenly determined. Then I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. You can't stop me, Margaret. If you're determined to do something this dangerous, you're not doing it alone. Margaret stared at her sister, seeing the stubborn set of Clara's jaw that meant no amount of arguing would change her mind. Clara, if something happens to me, Father still has you. If something happens to both of us, then Father will know he raised daughters who stood up for what was right instead of daughters who stayed silent while innocent people suffered. The simple courage in Clara's words took Margaret's breath away. Her little sister, who'd always been the practical one, the careful one, was willing to risk everything to help people she barely knew. All right, Margaret said quietly, but we do this smart. We ride hard, warn the Andersons, and get out of there before Vincent arrives. No heroics, no trying to fight armed men. Agreed. Agreed. As they prepared to leave, Margaret caught sight of herself in the broken mirror propped against her dresser. The woman looking back at her was someone she barely recognized. Not the obedient daughter who'd been preparing to marry Vincent Kane, but someone stronger, someone willing to risk everything for what was right. In a few hours, she was supposed to be standing at an altar promising to love, honor, and obey a man who saw violence as the solution to every problem. Instead, she was about to ride into danger to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. For the first time in months, Margaret felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The Anderson homestead sat in a valley between two low hills, looking peaceful as a Sunday morning despite the danger racing toward it across the prairie. Margaret and Clara had ridden hard for an hour, their horses lathered with sweat and their own hearts pounding with fear and determination. There, Margaret pointed toward the small log cabin with its neat vegetable garden and single milk cow grazing nearby. But Clara, I don't see any stolen cattle. Do you? Clara shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun, scanning the property carefully. Nothing, just their own few head in the far pasture. Margaret, if they rustled 50 cattle, where are they hiding them? Margaret's stomach tightened with dread. She'd been hoping to find obvious evidence of guilt. Stolen cattle, strange horses, signs of recent large-scale activity. Instead, the Anderson place looked exactly like what it was. A small family farm struggling to survive on the frontier. We need to warn them and get out of here, Margaret said, urging her mare down the hill. Vincent can't be more than 30 minutes behind us. As they approached the cabin, the front door opened and Tom Anderson stepped out, a rifle in his hands but not pointed at them. He was a lean man in his 30s, his face weathered by sun and wind, his clothes patched but clean. Behind him, Margaret could see his wife Sarah peering anxiously through the doorway. Miss Sinclair, Tom called out, recognizing Margaret despite her riding clothes and disheveled hair. What brings you ladies out here in such a hurry? Margaret dismounted quickly, her legs shaky from the hard ride. Mr. Anderson, you're in terrible danger. Vincent Kane is riding this way with a dozen armed men. They think you stole his cattle. Tom's face went pale. Stole his cattle? Miss, I haven't been off my property in 3 days except to check my own stock. What cattle? 50 head of breeding stock, taken during the earthquake this morning, Clara explained, sliding down from her horse. Someone told Vincent they saw your horse among the rustlers. Sarah Anderson appeared in the doorway, her 3 young children clustered behind her like baby birds. The youngest couldn't be more than 5 years old, with wide eyes and a thumb stuck firmly in his mouth. Tom, Sarah said quietly. What's this about? Tom lowered his rifle, his expression grim. Sounds like someone's trying to frame us for rustling. Sarah, get the children ready to travel. Now. Frame you? Margaret asked. Who would do such a thing? Someone who wants our land and knows Vincent Kane's reputation for dealing harshly with rustlers, Tom said bitterly. Miss Sinclair, we've been getting pressure to sell for months. Not just from Vincent, but from other folks too. This morning, right after the earthquake, a man came by offering to buy us out for triple what our place is worth. Margaret's blood ran cold. What man? Called himself Peterson. Said he represented investors from back east who wanted to buy up land in this area. Offered us enough money to start fresh somewhere else. No questions asked. Clara grabbed Margaret's arm. The bank president is named Peterson. But why would the bank president want to frame the Andersons? Margaret asked, though even as she said it, pieces were beginning to fall into place in her mind. Because, Tom said grimly, if we're convicted of rustling, our land goes up for auction. And guess who'd be in position to buy it cheap? Margaret felt sick. The bank would foreclose on the property, then sell it to Peterson's investors for a fraction of its real value. And Vincent Kane gets his revenge on rustlers. Peterson gets rich, and my family gets hanged for crimes we didn't commit, Tom finished. It's a neat little plan. Sarah was already packing essentials into a canvas bag, her movements quick and efficient. Tom, we can't run forever. If we leave, people will think we're guilty. If we stay, we'll be dead, Tom replied. Sarah, innocent doesn't matter when Vincent Kane's made up his mind about something. Margaret looked around the little homestead, the vegetable garden Sarah had planted by hand, the chicken coop Tom had built board by board, the small addition they'd added when their third child was born. This was their whole life, and they were about to lose it all because of other people's greed. Wait, she said suddenly. What if there was a way to prove your innocence? Tom laughed bitterly. How? Vincent's not coming here to listen to explanations. He's coming for blood. But what if someone else vouched for you? Someone Vincent couldn't ignore. Clara stared at her sister in horror. Margaret, no. You cannot seriously be thinking of staying here to face Vincent Kane. Not just Vincent, Margaret said, her mind racing. James Kane is probably with them. If I can get him to listen, if I can explain what really happened. Miss Sinclair, Tom interrupted. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you don't understand what you're dealing with. Vincent Kane in a rage isn't a man you can reason with. He's a force of nature. Then we'll have to find a way to stop the storm before it hits, Margaret said firmly. Sarah Anderson looked up from her packing, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Miss, you'd risk your life for people you barely know? I'd risk my life to prevent an injustice, Margaret corrected. There's a difference. The sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley, still distant but getting closer. Vincent's men were coming, and they were coming fast. Tom, Margaret said urgently, is there any way to prove where you were during the earthquake? Any witnesses who saw you on your property? Tom thought quickly. Old Henrik Peterson stopped by this morning to borrow some tools. He was here when the quake hit, stayed for about an hour after to make sure the cabin was sound. Henrik Peterson, Clara repeated. Any relation to the bank president? His uncle, Sarah said grimly. But Henrik's an honest man. He'd tell the truth if asked. Margaret's mind was working furiously. Where does Henrik live? About 2 miles east of here, Tom said. But miss, there's no time to fetch him. There's time if someone rides hard and fast, Margaret said, turning to Clara. Can you find Henrik Peterson and bring him back here? What about you? I'm staying here to try to keep Vincent from shooting first and asking questions later. Clara grabbed her sister's hands. Margaret, this is insane. You can't face down a dozen armed men by yourself. I won't be by myself, Margaret said, though her voice shook slightly. James Kane will be with them. He's reasonable, fair-minded. If I can get him to listen. James Kane is Vincent's brother, Tom pointed out. Blood runs thicker than water out here. Not always, Margaret said quietly, thinking of the way James had looked at her. The way he'd offered to help her family without asking for anything in return. Sometimes conscience runs thicker than blood. The sound of hooves was getting closer. In the distance, Margaret could see a dust cloud rising, marking Vincent's approach like smoke from a prairie fire. Clara, ride, Margaret ordered. Find Henrik Peterson and bring him back here as fast as you can. Tom, Sarah, gather your children and get inside the cabin. Let me try to talk to Vincent first. And if talking doesn't work? Sarah asked, her face pale with fear. Margaret looked at the approaching dust cloud, then at the rifle in Tom's hands. Then we'll find out what we're all really made of. As Clara spurred her horse eastward and the Anderson family retreated into their cabin, Margaret stood alone in the yard, watching the riders approach. Vincent Kane was coming for blood, and she was the only thing standing between him and an innocent family. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was steel. Today, she would discover whether love and justice were stronger than hatred and greed. Vincent Kane's horse reared up on its hind legs as he jerked the reins hard, his pale eyes blazing with fury when he spotted Margaret standing alone in the Andersons' front yard. Dust swirled around the dozen mounted men behind him, their rifles glinting in the late afternoon sun like the teeth of hungry wolves. "What in the hell are you doing here?" Vincent roared, his voice carrying across the valley like thunder. "You're supposed to be getting ready for our wedding." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand straight and meet his gaze. "I came to stop you from making a terrible mistake, Vincent. The Anderson family didn't steal your cattle." Vincent's laugh was cold as winter wind. "And how exactly would you know what these dirt farmers did or didn't do? You've been playing dress-up for a wedding while real men handle real business." Behind Vincent, Margaret could see James Kane sitting his horse with obvious discomfort, his storm-gray eyes moving between her and the Anderson cabin. Unlike his brother's men, James wasn't holding a rifle, and his expression suggested he was having serious doubts about this whole enterprise. "I know because I've been here long enough to look around," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Vincent, where are the 50 cattle you claim they stole? This property isn't big enough to hide that many animals." "They moved them," Vincent snarled. "Probably drove them into the Badlands to sell to buyers from down south. These settlers think they're clever, but they're not clever enough to steal from me." Tom Anderson's voice came from the cabin doorway, calm but carrying clearly across the yard. "Mr. Kane, I've never stolen so much as a chicken in my life. You're welcome to search my property, but you won't find your cattle here." Vincent's hand moved to the pistol at his hip. "I don't need to search anything, Anderson. I have a witness who saw your horse among the rustlers." "What witness?" Margaret demanded before Tom could respond. "Who exactly claims they saw Tom Anderson stealing your cattle?" Vincent's eyes narrowed dangerously. "That's not your concern, Margaret. Get on your horse and ride home before you get hurt." "I'm not leaving until this gets sorted out properly," Margaret said, taking a step forward despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "Vincent, you're talking about destroying a family based on one person's word. Don't you think that deserves more investigation?" "The only investigation I need is at the end of a rope," Vincent growled. "Anderson, come out here with your hands visible, or I'll come in after you." Margaret moved to stand directly between Vincent and the cabin door. "No." The single word hung in the air like a challenge. Vincent's face went from red to purple, the veins in his neck standing out like ropes. Behind him, his men shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of threatening a woman, even one who was defying their boss. "Get out of my way, Margaret," Vincent said, his voice deadly quiet. "Right now." "I won't let you hurt innocent people," Margaret replied, though her voice shook slightly. "If you want to get to that family, you'll have to go through me first." Vincent spurred his horse forward, close enough that Margaret could see the rage blazing in his pale eyes. "You seem to have forgotten that you belong to me. Tomorrow you'll be my wife, which means you do what I tell you to do." "I don't belong to anyone," Margaret shot back, anger overcoming her fear. "And after seeing what kind of man you really are, I wouldn't marry you if you were the last person on earth." The words escaped before she could stop them, and the silence that followed was deafening. Vincent stared at her as if she'd just declared the sky was green, his mind struggling to process what she'd said. "What did you just say to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's mouth went dry, but there was no taking back the words now. "I said I won't marry you, Vincent. Not tomorrow, not ever." Vincent's face went through several shades of red before settling on a color that reminded Margaret of dried blood. "You ungrateful little witch." After everything I've done for your family, after the money I've spent. Money you used to manipulate and control us, Margaret interrupted. Money based on lies about how much we actually owed. James Cain suddenly sat straighter in his saddle, his eyes sharpening with interest. What lies, Margaret? Vincent whirled toward his brother. Stay out of this, James. This doesn't concern you. Actually, James said calmly, it does concern me. Margaret, what did you mean about lies? Margaret felt a flicker of hope. If James was willing to listen, maybe she could expose the truth before Vincent's rage led to violence. Vincent told my father we owed $3,000, she explained quickly. But when someone checked with the bank, our real debt was only $800. Vincent inflated the amount to make himself look more generous, to make my family feel more desperate. That's ridiculous, Vincent snarled, but Margaret could see uncertainty flicker across the faces of his men. Why would I need to lie about anything? Because you don't know how to get what you want without trickery and threats, Margaret said, her confidence growing as she saw doubt spreading among Vincent's riders. Because you've never learned the difference between earning someone's respect and buying their fear. Jake, the young ranch hand who'd been assigned to watch Margaret earlier, spoke up hesitantly. Boss, is that true about the debt being smaller than you said? It doesn't matter what the debt was, Vincent snapped. I made an agreement with Sinclair, and he's going to honor it. An agreement based on false information isn't really an agreement, James said quietly. It's fraud. Vincent turned on his brother with such fury that his horse pranced sideways. How dare you take their side against family? I'm not taking sides against family, James replied steadily. I'm taking the side of truth against lies, justice against bullying. There's a difference. Margaret watched the brothers face each other across their horses, seeing years of tension and disagreement suddenly come to a head. Vincent represented everything harsh and grasping about frontier life, while James embodied its potential for fairness and decency. James, Vincent said, his voice low and dangerous. If you side with these people against me, you're no brother of mine. If threatening innocent families is what brotherhood means to you, James replied, then maybe I don't want to be your brother. The words hit Vincent like physical blows. For just a moment, Margaret saw something like hurt flicker across his face before it hardened back into rage. Fine, Vincent said coldly. Jake Martinez, round up Anderson and his family. We're settling this the way we should have from the beginning. Wait, Margaret cried out, but Vincent's men were already dismounting, their rifles ready. That's when Clara came thundering over the hill from the east, her horse lathered with sweat and a thin, elderly man clinging to the saddle behind her. Henrik Peterson looked terrified but determined as Clara pulled up beside Margaret. Vincent Cain, Henrik called out in a shaky but clear voice. Before you do something you'll regret, you need to hear what I have to say about Tom Anderson and those missing cattle. Vincent's hand paused on his pistol grip. What could you possibly know about it, old man? Henrik slid down from Clara's horse with Margaret's help, his weathered face serious. I know exactly where Tom Anderson was when your cattle got stolen, because I was here with him the whole time. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Margaret felt hope flare in her chest. Finally, a witness who could prove Tom's innocence. But the expression on Vincent's face suggested he wasn't ready to let facts get in the way of his revenge. Henrik Peterson stood in the dusty yard like an old oak tree facing a hurricane, his thin shoulders squared despite the rifles pointed in his direction. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, and Margaret could hear the Anderson children whispering fearfully inside the cabin behind her. Go on, Henrik, James Cain said encouragingly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Tell us what you saw. The old man nodded, his rheumy eyes moving from face to face among the mounted men. I came here this morning right after sunrise to borrow Tom's post-hole digger. My fence got damaged in that storm last week, and I needed to set some new posts before my milk cow wandered off. Vincent's face was a mask of barely controlled rage. Get to the point, old man. The point is, Henrik continued steadily, I was here when the earthquake hit around 9 o'clock. Tom and I were working on the fence line between our properties, and when the ground started shaking, we both ran for cover. Spent the better part of an hour making sure his cabin was still sound and checking on the livestock. Margaret felt her heart lift with hope. "What time did you leave, Mr. Peterson?" "Must have been close to 11 o'clock, Henrik replied. "I remember because Tom's wife rang the dinner bell, and I declined to stay because I wanted to get home to check my own place." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Boss, if he's telling the truth, then Anderson couldn't have been rustling cattle at 9 o'clock. He was here the whole time." "He's lying," Vincent snarled. "Or mistaken about the time. Old men don't remember things clearly." "My memory's just fine, Vincent Kane," Henrik shot back with surprising spirit. "And I remember something else too. Around 10:30, we saw a group of riders moving cattle along the ridgeline about a mile south of here. Too far away to make out faces, but close enough to count maybe a dozen men and a good-sized herd." Clara leaned forward in her saddle. "South? But Vincent, you said the rustlers headed southeast toward Devil's Canyon." "That's what Martinez reported," Vincent said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Martinez, the dust-covered rider who'd brought the original news, looked uncomfortable. "Well, boss, I might have been confused about the exact direction. After the earthquake, everything looked different, and—" "You might have been confused?" James Kane's voice was sharp. "Martinez, did you actually see the rustlers yourself? Or are you repeating what someone else told you?" Margaret watched Martinez squirm under James's steady gaze. Something was wrong here, something that went deeper than simple confusion. Well, sir, Pete Kowalski was the one who first spotted them. He came riding up to me all excited, said he'd seen the Anderson horse among the rustlers and that they were heading toward Devil's Canyon." "Where's Pete now?" James demanded. Martinez looked around as if just realizing something. "Come to think of it, I haven't seen Pete since he told me about the rustlers. He said he was going to track them some more, see if he could figure out exactly where they were headed." Margaret felt cold dread settling in her stomach. "James, who is Pete Kowalski?" "New hire," James said grimly. "Vincent brought him on about a month ago. Said he came with good recommendations, but I never did see those recommendations." Vincent was looking less certain by the minute, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Kowalski or no Kowalski, someone stole my cattle, and Anderson's the most likely suspect." "Based on what evidence?" Margaret challenged. "The word of a man who's mysteriously disappeared?" "Vincent, can't you see what's happening here?" "What I see," Vincent growled, "is my bride-to-be making a fool of herself defending dirt farmers and undermining my authority in front of my men." "I'm not your bride-to-be," Margaret said firmly. "I already told you I won't marry you." The reminder of her earlier rejection sent Vincent's rage spiraling higher. "You'll marry me if I have to drag you to the altar tied hand and foot. Your father signed an agreement." "An agreement based on lies," James interrupted. "Vincent, even if Margaret wanted to marry you, which she clearly doesn't, you can't force someone into marriage based on fraudulent information." Vincent pulled his pistol from its holster, the metal gleaming dully in the fading light. "I can do whatever I want, little brother. I've got the men, I've got the guns, and I've got the right." "The right?" Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Vincent, the only right you have is the right to make an ass of yourself in front of everyone who works for you." Several of Vincent's men actually smirked at that, quickly hiding their amusement when Vincent's murderous gaze swept over them. "That's enough," Vincent snarled, raising his pistol. "Anderson, come out here now, or I start shooting at whatever moves." Margaret stepped forward, placing herself directly in the line of fire. "If you want to shoot someone, Vincent, shoot me. But I won't let you hurt innocent people to satisfy your wounded pride." For a moment that felt like an eternity, Vincent held the gun pointed at Margaret's chest. She could see his finger tightening on the trigger, could see the madness of absolute rage burning in his pale eyes. That's when James Kane spurred his horse forward, putting himself between Vincent and Margaret. "Vincent," James said quietly, "look around you. Look at your men's faces. Look at what you're about to do." Is this really the man you want to be? Vincent's gaze flicked from face to face among his riders. Margaret could see doubt in their expressions, discomfort with the situation they'd found themselves in. These were working men, not killers, and the idea of shooting an unarmed woman clearly sat poorly with them. "She's defying me," Vincent said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "In front of everyone. I can't let that stand." "You can't let what stand?" James asked. "A woman expressing her own thoughts? A person refusing to be bullied?" "Vincent, when did we become the kind of men who solve problems with guns instead of justice?" Henrik Peterson stepped forward again, his old voice carrying clearly in the quiet afternoon air. "Vincent, I've known your family for 20 years. Your father was a hard man, but he was fair. He wouldn't have threatened innocent folks over some rustled cattle without proof." The mention of their father seemed to hit both brothers like a physical blow. Margaret saw something shift in Vincent's expression, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "My cattle are still missing," Vincent said, but the words came out more like a question than a statement. "Then let's find them," James said reasonably. "But let's do it the right way. Let's gather real evidence, track the actual rustlers, and bring them to justice according to law instead of lynch mob." Margaret held her breath, watching Vincent struggle with his pride and his rage. The pistol in his hand wavered slightly, and she dared to hope that reason might win out over violence. That's when they heard hoofbeats approaching from the west, and everyone turned to see a lone rider galloping toward them at breakneck speed. As the figure drew closer, Margaret could see it was Dr. Morrison from town, his face flushed with urgency. "Vincent," Dr. Morrison called out as he pulled up beside the group. "Thank God I found you. I have news about your cattle, and it's not what you think." Vincent slowly lowered his pistol. "What kind of news?" Dr. Morrison caught his breath, his eyes taking in the tense scene before him. "The rustlers have been caught, Vincent. Sheriff Williams and a posse tracked them down about 10 miles north of here. They've got your cattle, and they've got the men who stole them." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief, while Vincent stared at Dr. Morrison as if he'd announced the sky was falling. "Caught," Vincent repeated. "Who were they?" "That's the interesting part," Dr. Morrison said grimly. "It was Pete Kowalski and a gang he'd been working with for months. Turns out he's been scouting for them, identifying the best targets and spreading false information to throw suspicion on innocent folks." Margaret saw all the color drain from Vincent's face as the full implications hit him. He'd been ready to destroy an innocent family based on lies fed to him by the very man who'd orchestrated the theft. "Vincent," James said quietly, "maybe it's time to put that gun away and apologize to these people." But Vincent Kane had never apologized for anything in his life, and Margaret could see him struggling with emotions he didn't know how to handle. Pride, shame, rage, and confusion warred across his features as he looked from the Anderson cabin to Margaret to his own men. The question was, which emotion would win?